A forensic interview is supposed to be the start of a fair legal process. The witness tells what happened, the interviewer documents it, the case moves forward. But for people with intellectual and developmental and communication disabilities, that foundation is often failing before it's even built. Because interview protocols weren't designed with these witnesses in mind, interviewers aren't really trained to adjust, and when testimony comes out inconsistent, the people that get blamed are the witnesses themselves. So, what we've done in our paper is argue that this is a cycle. So, it starts with poor interview practices that lead to inconsistent testimony, and then inconsistent testimony reinforces credibility bias, and credibility bias is then used to justify continuing the same inadequate interviewing process. Forensic social workers are in a special place in which we have the skills and ethical obligation to help interrupt this cycle. So, we're going to start first with Heather, who is going to talk about who is being failed and how often. Okay, so unfortunately, I could not get Heather's video to download, so I am going to read through her notes for this section on victimization rates in the justice gap. So, people with intellectual disabilities are overrepresented in all levels of the legal system, and that's to the tune of nearly 10% over the general adult non incarcerated population. And that's not random. The intellectual and developmentally disabled population is also kind of being disproportionately targeted, along with others with communication and language disorders. So, this targeting is really due to the fact that communication barriers and behaviors are always getting misinterpreted. So, if you avoid eye contact with a police officer or take too long in their mind to answer the question or repeat the question, this could be seen as suspicious or evasive, even though this is just how people with intellectual or developmental disabilities or language based disorders might communicate. They might need more time, eye contact might be uncomfortable, or repeating a question is a strategy that SLPs teach people to do all the time. There's also those training deficits in law enforcement. So, on the other side of the coin, law enforcement officers aren't taught to recognize these things in people and not see them as necessarily suspicious or evasive. And then there's the saddest fact, which is kind of that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities or communication disorders don't report crimes. And oftentimes that's because they're being told that they're not going to be believed, or they're used to a lifetime of having what they say be misinterpreted and misconstrued. And next, Tyler is going to tell us what's happening in the interview room.
Hello. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how recommendations versus reality. There is a gap between policy and practice. So even though effective protocols exist, inconsistent training, time pressure, and integrated communication habits lead to interviews that prioritize compliance over accuracy. So closing the gap requires consistent adherence to protocols, ongoing training, and intentional adaptation to the needs of vulnerable witnesses. And I think this really stands out to me because I feel like it's applicable in a lot of social work aspects of things, the gap between policy and practice, and how sometimes they don't always align as they should. There are some ground rules that are supposed to be protective against certain pressures when it comes to interviewing, but research shows that the individuals may initially follow the rules, but accuracy drops when questioning becomes more suggestive. And individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities are especially vulnerable because they focus on pleasing people versus expressing uncertainty or unclarity, or being unclear. Sorry, I worded that kind of funky. So when they feel like they need to agree with you because they're more into that pleasing phase versus talking about uncertainty or not knowing something, that leads to inaccurate information. I think that that is all I have for my portion that really stood out to me. Just the differences in we have the protocols in place, but them not being followed is an interesting piece to the puzzle for me, and filling in that gap by continued training and adhering to protocols.
When thinking about individuals who have developmental disabilities, it'd be really important to look at how they may differ in interviews, as well as how the questions differ or the likelihood that the interviewer is going to deviate from the NICHD protocol. Question type really matters in these types of situations. Hershkowitz found that open questions, when asked to an individual who had an intellectual disability, they responded just fine. They responded 95% of the time. Brown, 2019, found that rules of the NICHD were followed 82% of the time with the same population. So they were able to grasp an understanding of what the interviewers were asking, and they were able to respond appropriately or giving an answer that actually benefited the case or provided the detective or interviewer with the information that they needed. The protocol is abandoned based on an assumption of three different things that came up from the research. The assumption that someone had a moderate disability, which usually indicated that the interviewer would abandon the protocol sooner. It was based on age, so saying, "Oh, this person interviewee isn't going to understand the questions that I have," or silence, which seems to be the biggest key here and key point is that when there was silence in the room, the interviewer was uncomfortable and they abandoned the protocol sooner. Another key point is questions changing and the response changing. There was a clear distinction between when that NICHD protocol was abandoned, the questions changed to be more close-ended, and the responses changed. So, as we saw above, when the rules of the NICHD protocol were followed, they were followed 80% of the time. When this protocol was abandoned, responses changed, and the rules were no longer followed. They were then followed to about 50% of the time. So a pretty big difference there. Pressure was also a big thing in societal norms. As a child, you're growing up and you're saying, "Hey, an adult's asking me a question. I need to respond to that." A lot of the times that pressure can then get in the way in these interviews, and that was noted to be a key factor as well. As not only is there more silence when you're interviewing an individual with a disability, but there's more pressure on that individual to respond, to give the interviewer the question that they want, especially when that NICHD protocol is abandoned and there's more of those close-ended or leading questions. Another key point here is importance of time, which was noted by both Brown studies, Brown et al. 2017 and Brown et al. 2019. Really importance here. We mentioned it above around the silence, the pressure, lack of patience was a big situation. If a person or an individual with an intellectual disability is taking longer to respond, they jumped in, they immediately abandoned that protocol, they were asking more of those closed-ended questions. There's also an incorrect interpretation of functioning. So just because a person has a disability doesn't mean that they're not going to understand the questions that they're asking. And really, it came down to overall discomfort of the interviewer. If they were feeling like, "Oh, this person has a disability, they're not understanding, there's a lot of silence in the room, I'm uncomfortable with that," they were more likely to abandon that protocol sooner, which led to more of the close-ended questions. Really, the overall key here is that silence doesn't necessarily mean misunderstanding. It often just means processing.
Hi, my name is Katie, and my section is on credibility, bias, and courtroom barriers. The courtroom doesn't adapt the way the interview room is supposed to, using the protocols that Angela talked about. Attorneys adjust their questioning for children, for elderly witnesses, for someone visually anxious, but they don't adjust for communication disabilities. So you end up with witnesses whose hesitation reads as deception, whose flat affect reads as indifference, and whose disjointed language reads as incompetence. None of that is about what they actually know. It's about how the courtroom hears them. What surprised me most was that education doesn't fix this. In Mara's autism study, jurors who were told the witness was autistic rated them warmer, but less competent. The bias didn't disappear, it just changed shape a bit. In the developmental language disorder mock trials I researched, even informed jurors returned zero guilty verdicts in the nonviolent case. DLD affects 7% of the population, and almost no one in the legal system has heard of it. But there are solutions. England and Wales have a registered intermediary program where a trained communication specialist assesses the witness, advises the attorneys, and intervenes in real time when a question breaks down. The US has nothing like it, and our research base reflects that. Most of the evidence comes from the UK. ADHD is almost entirely absent from the literature, and current legal standards in the US can be followed to the letter and still fail. So, in short, the system doesn't need better witnesses. It needs better questions, better listeners, and someone in the room who understands.
So the case law, legal standards, and the social work role. So the American with Disabilities Act of 1990 outlines that individuals with a disability can be someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a history or record of such an impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment, Forensic interviews are within the scope where the ADA must ensure that modifications or accommodations are required for individuals who have a disability or impairment. This helps to provide appropriate support and prevent discrimination so that forensic interviews can be adapted to an individual to meet their needs. The role of a forensic social worker is to adapt questions to the individual and assess for any possible cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, or impairments in order to better understand how individuals may recall events, answer questions, or how they can participate in the overall process. So social workers do have an ethical and professional obligation to accommodate and support those with a disability and or impairment. There is a large misinterpretation about those with an intellectual disability that it's seen as they cannot be a credible witness or provide accurate testimony, but they can be, especially with the right support. Um, Okay. Forensic social workers should be protecting the rights that are mentioned in the cases below, which would be Miranda versus Arizona, Atkins versus Virginia, and State versus WB. And these are some cases that outline the importance of these laws. So the first one with Miranda versus Arizona, questioning should not continue for individuals who do not understand their rights, because if someone who has a disability, whether they do or not, but in this case, if they do have a disability, if they don't understand their rights, they are not to continue, they're not supposed to be questioned or continue to be questioned once it's known, that they do not understand their rights. Secondly, Atkins versus Virginia, this goes to show that individuals with intellectual disability need those accommodations or modifications to ensure and safeguard the interviews and the legal process for them. Interview protocols, this one is for State versus WB. Interview protocols are important because a recording can support a jury and the court, and it goes to show accommodations were made for the individual. And so with the second one, with Atkins versus Virginia, um, I believe this one, he was mentally, I believe he had like an intellectual disability, like the mental capacity of a 9-year-old or a 12-year-old. And they wanted to sentence him to death for the crimes he committed. But I think eventually it was overruled and he didn't because of his mental capacity. Like he had the capacity mentally of a 9 or 12-year-old. And then interview protocols are important because it can help, if a recording is present, it goes to show everything was followed, protocols were followed. It can show, there's no accommodations were made. Everything was done correctly. And so it's not just going off statements, but showing. So the evidence reviewed on forensic interviewing of individuals with disabilities indicates that people with disabilities, impairments, or cognitive disabilities are capable of providing accurate and credible accounts of events when appropriate supports and accommodations are in place for them. Although this is dependent on the legal system and social workers following their ethical and legal responsibilities, research does suggest that issues with reliability and credibility comes from failures from professionals such as law enforcement, attorneys, and social workers because they need to adapt their practices rather than it being, the disability being at fault because no accommodations were made or no support was showed. When these requirements under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, are not met, it can result in biased credibility, which is why it is very important for the social workers, their role in advocating for fair and accessible interview practices. Because this makes a big difference on whether someone is seen as a credible witness or not. A social worker should assess cognitive and communication needs before interviewing individuals with a disability or impairment in order to avoid being coerced, or they're given confusing questions, and documenting to protect credibility under the federal rules of evidence. We recommend strong advocacy within the role of a social worker and legal system so that it is accessible, fair, and ethical so individuals with disabilities can participate in the process. Thank you. And here are the resources. I can move myself. Here they are. Thank you.